Thank you, all of you, for joining. I mean, I know how many sessions there are these days. One of the wonderful things about this COVID thing, if there's any silver lining at all, is that there's lots of chances now to attend all these sessions from all over the world. Uh, the other side is that there's a little bit of an overload. I mean, at least that's how I feel. Like I feel like I'm on Zoom, 90% of the time, and it's just it's tiring. But you chose to spend an hour with us, which I think is awesome. So I'm going to try to make this meaningful for you. I'm going to try to make it, if not fun, at least interesting. And I'm definitely going to try to make it applicable so you can use it for your own teams and your own organization. So this is a topic I care about quite a bit. So I think this is going to be kind of fun because it's a topic that I think a lot of us care about, the whole idea of metrics. So what are we going to talk about? Sort of three things. One thing is a little bit about metrics in general. Why do we do them? What are some of the benefits, some of the limitations? Some of these things you probably all know already, but I just want to point out a couple of things that's sometimes missed in the whole idea of metrics. And then tell you a little bit about the data that we have collected over the course of, well, almost 10 years now, and reveal some of the insights that we were able to see using statistical analysis. And I think there's some interesting things there that we can all benefit from. And then I'll outline a very simple process that you can use to create a culture of data-driven continuous improvement. There's no hocus pocus. There's no really fancy stuff here. It's just a very simple process you can use that I've used myself and I continue to use, and I've seen it work really well. So I just want to share that with you and go through that so that you can do this yourself for your own team and your own organization. And then ultimately just do some Q&A if we can do that. And as Amra was saying, we might even look at some of the data that we have gotten in. You all got that link. It's a psychological safety survey, and we'll see how those results are looking at going in here. And I'll see what those mean in terms of that process. So that's essentially what the workshop is about. It's not really a workshop as much as a presentation, but we'll do a little bit of talking about how that workshop might look if you do this for your own teams. Technically, this would be like a 2-day session if you really want to go into this in detail. But since we only have an hour, you at least get a little taste for it, which I hope will be useful. So first, let's just talk about metrics in general. Why do we have them? What's the purpose of them? Lots of definition around this. Here's kind of my definition of it. I mean, I think metrics at the end of the day are there for us to drive improvements, because I do think at the end of the day, we're using this for improvements, but we're doing it by facilitating organizational learning. So it's not something we do because we want to punish people or not even for performance measures as much as it is about learning. And I think that's something that we miss very often, especially when it comes to complex adaptive systems like, organizations that we're dealing with in terms of agile environments. Really what we're looking at here is to learn. And the faster we learn, the better, because we don't know all the answers up front. We don't know what the right answer is. That's part of what agility helps us do. So part of the corollary of all of this is that metrics is not really about the data at all. I mean, I know that sounds a little weird, but it's not really about the data. It's about what we learn from the data and then what we do with those insights. That's kind of the key here. And I think very often we miss this. I think very often metrics are used in the wrong way, and that can often actually provide really negative results. So let's talk about some of the limits of metrics. We use them all the time. There's some limits to them, and we should be aware of this. This has a cost. One thing is that metrics themselves take a lot of time sometimes. We spend a lot of time just collecting the metrics. And if we think of lean, and most of you are probably very familiar with lean terminology, that's a typical non-value added waste activity. Collecting the metrics themselves don't provide any value. So this is something we do because we are thinking that, well, at the end of the day, we still need them. But if you spend a lot of time on it, it actually takes time away from actually doing the real work, for producing something that means something to our clients and to our customers and our collaborators. So this is important. This is one of those parts that we very often don't take into account. It does take a lot of time to do. And there's some other limitations too. Think about this. There's lots of things that are important to your business, things that is hard to really measure, things like ethics, honesty, integrity, values that we hold very dear, that is the bedrock and the foundation of our organization. Many of these things are really hard to actually measure, and metrics very often can't really do a good job of that. So there's lots of other things that sort of fall in underneath there. So, but here's another one that I think is one of the worst parts of the limitations of metrics, and that is those unintended consequences. So I want you to try to put yourself in a situation now. So pretend that you're a surgeon, you're a heart surgeon, cardiologist, you've gone to school for many years, you're well respected, and of course you want to do well, you're competitive. And here you are, head of a department. And the key performance metrics that people use typically in this particular scenario are two metrics. This is in particular from a case study that happened in Texas, in the States. Number one is successful surgeries. And successful surgeries is defined as the patient return rate. What that means is if you're a patient and you have surgery conducted on you, they want to see that within 30 days, they don't want a return rate. They don't want you to have to go back again because the surgery wasn't done right. So they want that rate to go down, be very low. That's one success metric. The other is the annual fatality rate. So at the end of the day, they obviously don't want a lot of people dying from surgery. So that's another metric that they look at. Those two key performance metrics are very often used, in particular for this Texas hospital that I'm going to tell you about now. They use those two metrics. Now, what do you think happens if those are the two metrics that are used to measure your performance? If that's how your bonus is set, if that's how your promotion is set, how your career is set, if those two metrics are the ones that really determine how you're going to do, what do you think that does to the type of patients you take in? So let's say, for instance, that there is a complicated case. A person comes in, has an anomaly, a case that you haven't seen too many times before, but you could tell this is serious, definitely a heart problem. What do you think that particular doctor in that department is going to do? Well, I'll tell you what happened. Very often, what they would do is they would send that patient to another department or another hospital. And the reason for that is that if there are very complicated cases, the chance of a successful surgery is probably a little bit lower and the annual fatality rate can go up. So what that did was that particular department only took in those very, very simple vanilla case heart surgeries that they could find. They did everything they could to avoid those complicated cases. That might be good for them as surgeons, but certainly not good for us as patients because then you ended up being shifted around to other departments. That's one of those unintended consequences that can happen if you use these metrics for the wrong reasons. So be very careful with what kind of unintended consequences can happen. Here's another one. This is a classic. Wells Fargo, huge financial institution in the United States. One of the things that the CEO did there a couple of years ago was to say, all of our salespeople, their key performance metric is going to be increasing the average number of accounts per customer. Because they knew that if you could get every customer to have 2 or 3 accounts, so let's say you have a checking account, maybe have them do a savings account and a trading account or some other account in addition, that would increase their profitability. So that was the big go-to that they asked all their people to strive for. And these salespeople are typically paid by commission. So they weren't paid that well, but they got bonuses based on that particular metric. And by the way, if they didn't meet their goals, they might even get fired. So what do you think happened? Well, what happened is a lot of these salespeople would try very hard to make that metric happen. They try to sell another count to existing customers. In fact, I remember myself, I was a customer, and I remember I had a really annoying customer service representative just trying to get me to get another savings account, which I really didn't need, but they kept pushing, and that's what they kept doing. But then when customers said no, what they would do is they would add another account anyway behind the scenes without the customer knowing it. Now, this looked great, of course, for that sales rep because he or she could then go back to say to their manager, "Hey, look at me! I had 500 customers. Most of them actually added 2 accounts. Hey, look at that! Don't I look great? Don't I get my bonus?" Well, yeah, they got their bonuses, but of course, customers they didn't know this right away because there was no money in those accounts. But as you started getting account notices, they realized, "What is this? I never opened a savings account." They did this without the express written approval of the customers. And ultimately, Wells Fargo was found fraudulent. And that, of course, ended up being a multi-billion-dollar suit. So these are the kind of things that can happen when you have metrics that actually don't do what they're supposed to do. They don't facilitate learning, and they ended up being, in fact, harmless for the organization or harmful. This is a quote that I like from Charles Goodhart. He's famous in the areas of metrics. And one thing that he says, when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. It's one of those things you have to let it sink in a little bit. When the measure itself becomes the target, it's no longer a good measure, because then you end up focusing on that and that only, and by no all means necessary, which ultimately creates a lot of harm. So how do you fix this? Knowing that there's some challenges for metrics, knowing that they also are important, how can we do this in a meaningful way? Well, here's a couple of characteristics of meaningful metrics. Some metrics that I like, some metrics that I've seen work. This one I think you may have heard of before, the 3 A's: actionable, accessible, and auditable. This is coming from Eric Ries's book, The Lean Startup. I love these three. Actionable, the idea is that when you have one of these metrics, there should be some action you can take based on what that metric is. Accessible in the sense that it should be easy to understand. It shouldn't be one of those metrics that you have to scratch your head and say, what does this mean? What am I doing with this? And make it auditable. Make sure that these metrics are transparent and that you can't game them. They should be automated if possible, because people tend to game stuff, not because they're bad people, but if their salary is dependent on it, that tends to happen. So those are three things that I like very much. A couple others that I like. First of all, limit the number of metrics that you capture. If you capture too many metrics, well, not only does it take a long time, it's really hard to make sense of it. I can't tell you how many times I've gone to large meetings where I've collected 25, 30 different metrics for a program that I was managing. And we would go through those metrics and try to make sense of it and say, okay, now what? It will be really difficult to make sense of it. It's just too much analysis paralysis, which I'm sure you heard before. So my recommendation here is try not to do too many of these metrics. Try to limit the number of metrics that you capture. Second of all, look at the trends. Don't look at the snapshots. A snapshot in itself might give you an idea what's going on, but it really is the development over time that matters. Snapshots can be misleading. They can be particular things that happen in one particular time. Trends, by the way, though, give you an idea of direction, which is a lot more important in complex adaptive systems. That's another thing I recommend you do. And lastly, and this one is tricky sometimes, keep a holistic focus. Measure competing items. Make sure that one thing competes with the other so that you don't sub-optimize. Don't do it in a way that you focus on only one thing and forget about the other. Like, say, for instance, customer, a typical metric that they have in for instance, call centers would be how much time does it take when you deal with a customer support call. One of the metrics they use is the time it takes. And typically what they want to do is spend as little time as possible. That in a way is supposed to say, okay, you resolve the issue quickly. Well, maybe that could be one metric, but the other metric then should be customer satisfaction. How happy was the customer with that call? I mean, if you're rude, if you're not actually solving the problem, you're just getting off the call really quick, that's not solving any problems at all. That's not actually measuring what you want. So make sure you have a competing metric as well. So let's put this together and give you a concrete example, because this is something I've been using myself, and I cover this in some detail in my book. And what we're looking at here is a holistic perspective, a balanced view, so that when you look at your metrics, you can balance while at the same time make sure that you can unlock agility, which really requires that you balance not just building the right thing, which is building the thing that the customer cares about, but also building the thing right in the sense that it has to be done with quality, and then also building it at the right speed. You have to optimize for flow. So what are some of the metrics you can do to create that balance? I'll give you six, and I'll love to hear what you think later on to see if you have any ones that might be similar to this. Here's two that I use here for building the right thing. Again, here we're trying to measure, are you building something that the customer cares about? Net Promoter Score. I'm not sure if you heard of this, but it's a relatively standard metric to kind of capture whether or not the customer will recommend the particular product or service. It's a very simple question. Would you recommend this product or service to a friend or colleague? That's the question. And then you rate that. And then depending on that score, you can see whether or not the customer actually likes what you're building. I like that one as a way to approximate whether or not you're building the right thing. But here's the other one: percentage sales from new offerings. This one is a little bit of a twist. What I like to do in my programs is typically to look at our entire portfolio and say, how much percentage of sales in that portfolio is coming from offerings that are less than 2 years old? That's a nice thing to put in. And the reason I like this one is it forces you to think new. It forces you to focus on innovation and not just ride a product that's already doing good. It doesn't encourage any innovation if you just do a product that's already working well. This is a way for you to make sure you also capture that innovation part. Nice balance and metric. Now, how about this one? Building the thing right. Making sure that you have quality built in. This one is a classic. Mean time to recovery. How much time does it take when the system goes down, when the build breaks? How much time does it take before you get up and running again? I like this metric, not only because it's completely automated, but also because it says something about the pride of the team. Are we comfortable with a broken build for hours? Or is it something that encourages us to swarm together and fix it? So I like that one. It also says something about our architecture and the quality that we have. And this is a classic. Escape defects. Again, look at the trends here. How many defects do we have in production? Those are nice things to let us know in a lagging way whether or not we're having some quality that we build in. All right, now what about the right speed? How do we know now that we have these? We know that we're building the right thing and we know we're doing it in the right way. How do we do it in a way that has a pace that we can sustain and also that we can do it in a way that encourages flow? Lead time. This one is a wonderful metric and it is so simple. And maybe that's part of the reason I love it. Lead time, of course, as opposed to cycle time, is really the time it takes from a need is discovered until a need is fulfilled. That time is what we call lead time. And what I love about that, it actually encourages us to collaborate. It encourages us to look at the entire value stream from concept to cash. And all of us have to actually work together for that lead time to go down. It doesn't, if Joe for some reason has a problem, it is in my best interest to help Joe so that we can get that lead time down because we all share in that responsibility. The other metric I like here is flow efficiency percentage. The time it takes in terms of the wait time and the actually value added time. Looking at that ratio, how much of our time are we spending waiting? How much of the time are we spending not actually producing value when you think about that value stream? Really easy to calculate and super important when it comes to flow efficiency. So this one is what I recommend. And as you see, these are 6 metrics. If you can do something like this, you have a balancing act here. The idea of speed, yes, that's great. But if you also don't have quality, that's when you can start kind of optimizing or rather sub-optimizing for one part of the organization. So think of that when you look at your metrics. Leading versus lagging indicators. These are good. Metrics are all not all created the same. And I think there's a couple of things that's nice to know in terms of balancing this. Leading indicators, we don't know for sure, but typically we look at this and we say, well, these are measurements that might predict the future. Calories consumed per day. What do you think that's a leading indicator of? Well, probably whether or not you're going to gain some weight, right? That sounds like reasonable. Click-through rates on ads. If you have a lot of click-throughs, you might think that might actually increase your sales. And employee engagement scores. That might also be a leading indicator for, say, attrition, people leaving the company, for instance. And here are the lagging indicators. That's the actual results. Weight, of course, being a lagging indicator. It's nice to check your weight, but it's already kind of happened at the time you check that weight. So it's not a leading indicator. Same thing with the sales and the employee attrition rate. These are all sort of outcomes. So balancing those can be really important when you look at how you look at culture and how you integrate the metrics into your culture. So a little bit about metrics. Some of this you probably knew, but some of this I hope was useful, especially regarding the learning portion. What I want to talk about now, though, is what the data can tell us. Because the data can teach us quite a bit of things here. There's a little bit of AI I want to share with you as well. And what I think is really fascinating here is to find out what the data can tell us about high performing teams. So I'm going to share some of this with you. We'll see if any of this is perhaps surprising, and at least some of this might confirm things you already know. So here's where the data comes from, by the way. So comparative agility, I'm not sure if you ever tried our platform, but it is a platform that at the end of the day is all about validated surveys created by domain experts. We have all these surveys that's created by different domain experts like Amy Edmondson, Mike Cohn, Kenny Rubin, and then we have data scientists making sure that the surveys themselves are valid. Over time, lots of companies have used us. More than 14,000 organizations have used us now. We have more than 50,000 unique responses. 3.5 million data points. It keeps growing. People want to know how they're doing and they want to measure themselves. So it's been really useful and it's awesome to see that people are finding the platform interesting. But what I asked our data scientists was to say, all right, we have all these wonderful data points and we can see how people are working. What is it telling us? What are some of the patterns? What are some of the norms, some of the behaviors that we can see, especially among those high performing teams that are different from average teams? So I'll share some of that with you now. So here's what we did. First, we looked at the best performing companies that we have in our index. We looked at all those companies. There's, just about 14,000 organizations. First, what we did is we looked at the public companies, the ones that actually have publicly available information. So we looked at information like EPS growth, earnings per share growth. We looked at market share, and then we looked at profitability. Those were the three metrics we used to say, okay, which companies are the best performing companies in our index? Then we looked at those. Okay, fair. Now, then we looked at the highest performing teams inside of those best performing companies. So now we're looking at the best of the best organizations in very objective metrics, and then looking at the best performing teams inside of that. And then we said, what is the strongest correlation that these teams have with positive outcomes? And when we talk about positive outcomes, there were three things we looked at. We looked at NPS or customer satisfaction. We looked at quality in terms of the way that they actually develop products that had a high level of quality. And then ultimately, we looked at speed. So those three things. So now we have a pretty good idea of really high performing behavior in high performing teams in the best companies that we have in our index. So what did we find? Well, here we're going to be a little bit into statistics for those of you who are into that. So this might look a little overwhelming when I show you this right away. You're just like, what the heck are we looking at? But I'll explain it and it will make sense. So this is what's called a Pearson Matrix. I think it's actually called a Pearson Matrix. It basically shows a Pearson correlation between different items inside a survey. And what you see on the left-hand side are the high performers, and then what you see on the right-hand side are the average teams. And what you're looking for here are differences in the shade, the shade of blue, and then you're looking for the shape of the actual, what should we call it, oval in this case. So what you're really looking for are the shade to be stronger blue, which show that there's a stronger correlation, and then you want to look at the shape to be a little bit smaller or narrower because that also shows a strong correlation. So let me point these out to you so you can see the difference. Here, I'm not sure, depending on the resolution of your screen, you may or may not see this, but I hope you can see that there's a difference here between those two dots, between the high performers and the low performers. You can see that that thing on the left there is slightly narrower and it's also more blue. And that is the product owner maintains a prioritized product backlog. What we're seeing here is that the contribution margin, which is actually the amount of which this particular behavior contributes to positive outcomes, is 2.3 times higher for high performers than it is for average teams. So that's one thing that really separates those two. The other is this one here. You can also see, I hope you can see this on your screen, that there's a difference there, not only in the color, but also in the shape of that particular dot. Upfront planning is helpful without being excessive. So we're talking emergent planning here, not big design up front, right? People being able to embrace emergent architecture. Those are the kind of things that we saw right away when it comes to the planning dimension that really stood out among high performing teams. There's a couple other things I want to share. Culture. Look at this one here. Pretty big difference here between those two dots. Titles are not significant in how team members interact with one another. What's that telling you? That's talking to you about contributions, talking to you about being safe, that you're able to talk, speak up, and not be worried about saying something because you might not be a senior developer or even a senior member of the team. We see here that the high performing teams to a 2.5 times contribution are much stronger correlated here to positive outcomes. Here's a couple others that I thought was important. In continuous improvement, which is not surprising, but this one stood out for me. The team holds retrospective meetings at the end of each iteration in which the team evaluates how they're doing and discuss how to get better. This one for me was good to see because when I coach teams, very often what I see is that the retrospective tends to sort of be the one that people very often sort of like, we could scrap the retrospective. That's not so important. Well, what we're starting to see here is that teams that do that consistently tend to actually perform better in an objective manner. So that to me was really good to see. And this one here, more than anything else, the team acts on retrospective feedback in a timely manner. Not only do they do retrospectives, they actually deal with the feedback quickly. They take action. It's not a bitching session. It's not us sitting down here just complaining, not doing anything. We actually do something. And that to me was really great to see. So when I looked at this, a couple of things stand out. I'll say one thing that actually surprised you. There were a lot of things that didn't stand out. I'll say that because that's probably one of the most surprising things when we looked at the data. A lot of those high performing teams do a lot of the same things that average teams do. But that being said, a couple of things stood out. And those are the things you saw here. High performing teams, they tend to embrace emerging planning and they have a deep involvement from product management. They have someone there representing the customer. Not surprising, but it's just good to see the data actually represent this. The other part here, high performing teams, they work in a safe environment. Titles are not so important. They can actually speak up, not be afraid of being shut down if they say something unpopular. I like that part as well. And of course, this one here, which I think is crucial to agility, they take continuous improvement seriously. They reflect on their work and they take action on the findings. That's probably the one thing that I think a lot of teams don't do very often. They actually do the retrospectives, but then they actually have to do something with it too. So good stuff. I hope some of this confirmed what you already knew, and maybe some of it might have surprised you too. But at least some of this data can back up your own confirmations as a coach. But here comes the thing that I thought was kind of interesting. So we have all this data, and now I'm not a data scientist, but we do have three of them on staff. So I asked them. I basically gave them a challenge. I said, okay, why don't we take all this data, and they are customers of ours who are willing to opt into this, why don't you try to make those correlations and try to train the data and try to see if you can find the single most important thing from an AI perspective that actually can help us show us what statement, what question in our survey has the highest predictive value to these three items: customer satisfaction, quality improvement, and speed to market. Those are those three things that I told you about. So what they did is they took an open source neural network, and you guys have probably done this already, but there's lots of these open source neural networks that are available now. They believe they took one from Oxford University, and then they used that neural network on our data and data from some of our customers that were willing to share this. And what they were basically supposed to do here is find out that one statement that had the highest predictive value. And this is the statement that they found. How about that? The team acts on retrospective feedback in a timely manner. I have to say, I was a little bit surprised because I was thinking it was going to be something really sort of exotic that I haven't thought of before. But on the other hand, it was great to see it because, I mean, if you think about agility, isn't this kind of what this is about? About learning, about doing things when you see something isn't working, using empiricism to improve the way you work. I like that. And I also like that it doesn't say anything about sprints or iterations. The idea just being that it's the feedback that matters here and that you take action on it in a timely manner. So that to me was just great to see. It just made me kind of say, okay, all right, it makes sense. It sort of it passed the gut test. Let's put it that way. So this is all good. This is great. We know now that metrics can be useful. We know they can be, in fact, harmful if we're not careful about how we use it. But at the same point, we also know that it's not enough because data can help us separate the signal from the noise, but what it doesn't explain to us is the why. It doesn't explain the why. It doesn't say why this is the case. It just shows us that this is what's happening. This is what those high performing teams do that the average teams don't. Here's where your team is indicating there's a challenge, but it doesn't say why. So how do you find that out? Well, you don't find that out through the data. This is where you as a coach need to do something. And that's what I would submit is our job as change leaders. We need to engage with the teams to figure that out and then create that environment of safety, autonomy, and high performance so we can actually take advantage of this data and create a culture of continuous improvement. So that's what I'm going to outline for you now. I'm going to take a really concrete example that just came from that data that you sent me earlier today, and then go through a process that you can use right now when you go back to your desk. And yeah, well, it's your own desk now, so you're not going back to work, but you can work remotely and follow this process yourself. And I can guarantee you that it'll work because it's quite simple. but it doesn't really require a lot of hocus pocus. So let's do this. Here's where we start. We start with the narrative. And what I'm looking at here is this survey that you just took. And I'm looking at different parts of the survey. And here's one thing that really stood out to me. If you look here, the yellow, or actually the red line here is your data set. And your data set in this case is our data set, the data that you submitted. And if you look at the black line, it's the world index for this particular survey. And what we're seeing is that there is quite a bit of gap here between the world index and what we said. And it's actually a negative gap. It shows that for this particular question, we have a relatively large deficiency compared to the world index. And the question is, it is completely safe to take a risk on this team. All right, that's interesting. Now let's dig in a little bit deeper. And then what we can look at now is what we call box plots. Those of you who have taken statistics, you don't have to be a PhD, but simple statistics, you've probably heard of box plots. Box plots are essential, I want to call it a statistical visual way to show the coherence inside the data, the range of responses inside of that data set. And if you look at that particular question, it is completely safe to take a risk on the team. Notice that the vertical bar for that particular question is pretty long. And the longer the vertical bar, the longer range you see. So what is that telling you? Well, that's telling you that within that particular question for our data set, and there was about 20, 25 of you who responded, we can see that people are not really agreeing with each other. They're all over the place for that one. These are the 6 that we saw before. So what do we do about this? Now that we know that, what do we do? What does this mean? Well, there's a couple of things we can do about this, and that's to take this data further and actually take advantage of it and make meaning out of it. And this is what I recommend you do. Don't have to do it this way. You can use any tool you like, but here's what I've been doing, and I typically see a lot of results from this. The first thing I like to do is to say, all right, we found the narrative here. We were looking at the data. We found a couple of things that really stood out. We can see the story that's emerging. Now let's actually talk with the teams. Let's start interacting with the teams. Many ways you can do this. For those of us who are agile coaches, you've probably dealt with open space before. Typical nice way to interact with with teams and programs. You can use liberating structures, which is another thing you probably heard about. Very nice ways to sort of interact with teams. But I like kind of like a modified open space session. What I like to do very, very early on is to say, all right, let's look at the data. Let's have the team in front of us. And let's talk about this. Let's look at the data and ask ourselves, what are the impediments that we observe when we look at what's going on? And let's take this question. The question was, it is completely safe to take risks on this team. Remember, that was the question. Now, what are the impediments that we observe that's related to that question? And when we ask that question, they might say something like, well, we can see we score pretty low on this. And let's be honest, we don't really take a lot of chances. We don't have a lot of innovation happening in our team. And to be fair, creativity is down. We're not as creative as we could be. Okay, those are fair observations. We've seen this. The data backs it up. So what? What is the impact of those impediments? What does it do to us and to our company and to our product when that's the case? Well, we might hear things like, well, customers aren't really very happy. We're keeping things kind of keep delivering what we're delivering. We're not innovating at all. We can see that employees aren't really engaged because they don't really get to use their creative mind at all. And well, we're seeing that we're losing market share. Our competition is doing something that we're not doing because we just don't have that creative juice anymore. Okay, well, now what? Now that we know this, what are we going to do about it? What are some of the actions we can take? Well, maybe one thing could be to have our manager maybe be aware of this. Maybe we can talk to the manager about, well, things around maybe creating a little bit of psychological safety, for instance, or making it safe to people to take experiments. Maybe we can just do an experiment, a simple thing that doesn't create a lot of risk, and just try something new in a safe context, so that we're not betting the company and not taking a huge risk, but just do something that actually pushes us a little bit. And maybe we can just try this for a couple of sprints just to see if it makes a difference, just to see if it's possible for us to do a safe to fail experiment. Simple way to at least move in the right direction, just to see how it's going. Fair. Now, this is good. We have the data. We talk to our teams. That's great. Now let's go one-on-one. Let's actually talk to the team members individually and one-on-one. And I like to do this And I like to do with around, I want to say 10, 15, 20% of the team. I don't necessarily do it with the entire team, but I like to do it with some of them. And what I like to do is just kind of go one-on-one, completely safe, very confidential, and ask them a couple of questions like, what surprised you about these results? You know, what is the change you would make if you could make that change yourself, knowing what you just saw? And what are some of the things that the data isn't telling us? These are really interesting questions that give a lot of extra information that you wouldn't have gotten otherwise. And you'll be surprised what kind of things you will learn. There's things there about management behavior, maybe some teamwork dysfunction, cultural issues, all these kind of things that is really hard to capture through any objective metrics or even surveys. This is the kind of stuff you'll get by doing that kind of investment. So I always recommend you do that as well. And then, and you really should not do this, gather objective metrics. You got to combine the subjective metrics that we have, which is super important, with the objective metrics. We talked about some of them already, but make sure you have that complement. Make sure you think of things like lead time, flow efficiency. We talked about that. The MTTR measure, the defects in production, all these kind of things we talked about earlier. Bring those in as well because you want to see the correlation between these things. The good thing about agile, and this is the thing I really love, is that we're not selling snake oil. We know agile works. It's almost like physics. If you do these things will happen. If you reduce work in progress, you will be faster. If you automate, you will be faster. If your quality and your TDD processes, if they look at emergent design, you will deliver higher quality software. This just works. So we don't have to come up with any stories here. We know that these things work. So why don't we put in some outcomes-based metrics to make sure that we can see the correlations between this? We know already from some of the data we've done that if you do these things, you will actually end up having higher outcomes in terms of quality, customer satisfaction, and speed. So we know this works, but we have to show it to our managers. And here's the last part. This sounds so obvious, but you'll be surprised. This is the one thing that people kind of not do well enough. You got to take action. It's great to do the surveys, it's great to gather the data, but you actually have to do something with this. This learning is gold, and you need to take advantage of that gold and take action. And what I recommend you do here is you gain support from leadership. That's not just support. Yeah, that sounds great. Let it actually be financial support and organizational support. Make sure you show your work, show the research you've done, and come to Mr. or Mrs. Leader and say, hey, here's what I did. Here's the data that I used. I used a third-party survey. It's validated by data scientists. It's made by domain experts. I talked to my team. I had one-on-one conversations. I correlated that with objective metrics. Here's the one or two things I'd like to do as a result of that data. Here are the one or two things I'd like to improve, and communicate that when you get that improvement, and don't do too many things at once. Do one or two improvements, not 18, because we know about WIP. If you do too many things at once, you get nothing done. And I'll tell you this, if you do that kind of homework, if you combine the things I just told you about, you combine objective data with subjective data, you combine it with observations from the team, I don't think there's a lot of leaders who are interested in agility who will say no to that. They will see that you're being reasonable. They will see that you're using data in a reasonable way and that you're not asking for something that's in any way not logical. And they will say, okay, fair enough. We can try this. One or two things, that's fair. And then keep doing that every 3 months, at least. And as you keep doing that over time, you will build that culture of continuous improvement, because the least thing you can do is to show the people who took that survey, who spent 15 minutes, that we listened to them and that we actually made changes based on that. That makes a big difference. I'm not sure if you've ever been in this situation, but I have, believe me. I've taken surveys, and I take the survey. It was called a pulse survey. Ever heard of those pulse surveys? I took that survey, I think 60 questions or something, spent the time on it, and there was even an open box at the end where I could suggest some things. I think I spent 15, 20 minutes just on that, sent it over, and I waited, and nothing happened. There was literally nothing happened. And I was so disappointed because I put a lot of myself in there. I really wanted this organization. I loved the company I was working for, and I really wanted them to be better. So I poured my soul into this thing, and nothing came back. And that is very demotivating. So that's my little warning here to you. When you're doing these continuous improvement efforts, take action and communicate it. Don't just let that be something you put on your backlog somewhere and nothing happens. Limit WIP and do it, because if you don't, it can actually have the exact opposite effect. It can actually create a culture of, well, the opposite of continuous improvement, because this is really important, and it is frankly respectful for the people who take that time. So that's my little warning there. So in a nutshell, here's how the process works. You collect the data. Doesn't take long to do that. I mean, we're talking, about 15 to 20 minutes of the person filling out the survey, and for you sending it out. It's not a huge process at all. Doesn't take many minutes at all. Find the narrative. Look at the data. Understand the data. See what the data is trying to tell you. Understand how teams are doing compared to their industry. See how the teams are doing compared to themselves over time. Find out what the story is being told here. Understand the context. Talk to your teams. I can't tell you that enough, because at the end of the day, we're not going to solve this unless we actually talk to the teams. And then go one-on-one. Have that conversation with the people who are taking the survey. Go one-on-one with them. Make sure you understand what's behind it. Gather the objective metrics, and then take action. Do something with the data, make a difference, visualize it, communicate it, and then do this regularly so that people can see that if they respond to the survey, you will take what they say seriously and you will actually make a real change. So that's the process. It's really not that complicated. And honestly, you don't need a lot of tools for this. This is not very expensive from a tools perspective. It's literally about individuals and interactions over processes and tools. So that's the process. All good, right? Well, there is this little thing that I think it's important to talk about, because yes, this does work, and it's been proven, but there is something we need to worry about here that is very important that we sometimes don't think about, and that is that the teams themselves, they can tell us a lot of good. They can be very honest with you, and they can tell us what's going on so that we can actually take action on it. But it's really hard to do any of this without psychological safety. And honestly, I think this is a relatively new term. And well, I shouldn't say that. Dr. Amy Edmondson, who coined the term, she came up with this term in 1999 when she first released her research. But it's only until the 2000s when this is becoming a thing that us in the Agile community is talking about. And honestly, this is something that I think has been a problem with why retrospectives sometimes are perceived as being unhelpful. And remember, I told you earlier that a lot of these retrospectives sometimes devolve into bitching sessions. Well, I've been part of those sometimes. And honestly, the reason they turn into that sometimes is because people don't really feel safe in the sense that they can make any changes. They say, okay, we're seeing all these impediments and we know the things we need to do to fix them, but we're not going to be allowed to, or management's not going to support it. And it's not going to make a difference because we're not going to get any funding for them. Like all these kind of things happen all the time because they don't have that environment, that safety, that support from management to do it. And well, it's not so strange then that they become bitching sessions, because they're then basically an exercise in frustration. You keep doing these things, you keep seeing where the problems are, and you can't do anything about it. So that's really difficult. So psych safety is completely important to this. So I'll tell you a little bit about that and also what it means and how you can create it. So it's not a new term, even though the term itself, as opposed to you can say, is new in the literature. It comes from Anzen, which for those of us who are into lean, you've heard of this before. What you see here is what's called an andon cord. And in a production environment, the andon cord is essentially a cord that you can pull, and if you pull it, then the entire factory line will just stop. Like it just nothing happens. It just stops. And what you see here, this is a picture from a factory in Toyota. And when that particular employee pulls that cord, what happens is that the entire factory line stops. And those of you who know anything about manufacturing, especially car manufacturing, you know that every second that you don't produce anything is very, very expensive. So what happens then is that the entire company basically stops and everybody swarms. All employees come over and they say, what's wrong? How can we help you? So what happens now is that we say, hey, there's a problem on the line. We got to fix this together. and it becomes a team effort. Everyone works together and they figure out what the problem is and they move on. And then the line starts again. Now, at GM, for instance, which you may have heard before, if you did something like that at GM, if you stopped that product line, it would be what we call a career limiting move. It would be one of those things that would more or less guarantee that you'll be fired because you'd never stop the line. We keep producing our cars until we hit our targets. Big difference there, right? In the terms of culture and the safety you have. People here feel safe. They have Anzen that they can actually pull that cord and tell everyone when something is wrong. So this is Dr. Amy Edmondson's definition of psych safety. She's used a couple of different ways of saying it, but I like this one because it's kind of simple, and I think it's one of those that I think we can all understand. She's basically saying that psychological safety is it's a belief that you will not be punished or humiliated for speaking up with ideas, questions, concerns, or mistake. You can literally say something to your manager, to other team members, and you will not be ridiculed. You will not be belittled in any way. And that's hard sometimes to create that environment. I'm not sure if you know the story behind how she came up with this term, but it actually was done in a hospital setting. We used the hospital earlier as an example. So let me tell you how she came up with it. What she did is she looked at research, and especially she looked at error rates and quality in terms of care in hospitals and in the healthcare industry. And what she saw was a very strange thing. She saw that the hospitals who had the highest rates of error were the hospitals that also had the lowest fatality rates and the lowest return rates. So let me say that again because it sounds really weird, right? She said that the hospitals that made them make the most mistakes were the ones that actually had the best outcomes in terms of the patients. So she was looking at those results and she was going through the data and she checked it again. And she says, like, this doesn't make any sense. Why is it that those people who are making the most mistakes are actually producing better results? Why is going on here? So then she started digging into it. And what she found was pretty revealing. She found that those hospitals with worse results actually made a lot more mistakes, but they just didn't show them. They put them under the carpet, they had them hidden away somewhere, they never spoke about it, and they were always there. They just were never exposed. So what that told her was that those hospitals that did pretty well, yeah, they made mistakes. I mean, we're humans after all, but they were very open about it and they were not afraid to talk about it. That's in fact what made them strong because they learned from the mistakes and they were not afraid to speak up when there was a mistake. So that was what created that term of psychological safety. And she used that in a hospital setting. What's happened later, of course, is Google, among one of many companies, have been able to validate that that's in case what's happening with high performing teams. It's one of those things that tend to happen if you look at intelligence, which school you go to, your skill level, all of those things. Very, very small differences there between high performing teams and average teams. But when it comes to psych safety, it's a big difference. Those high performing teams tend to have a high level of psych safety. So, and we saw that also in our research, of course. We saw that among those teams, they're not worried about speaking up. So that's where the research comes from and how you could see that in terms of the level of performance in the teams. Now, how do you do this? And for those of us who are change leaders, there's a whole book. I mean, I love her book on this, by the way. It's called Fearless Organization. I highly recommend you pick it up. Easy read. And there's a couple of really great things she shows here. But here's kind of the top four that I thought was interesting. Lead by example. As leaders, and you don't have to be a leader, sort of formally, but I think all of us can be leaders without having that formal title. I think part of what's important here is to lead by example. You need to sort of acknowledge mistakes. She calls it secure vulnerability. Like be secure in your own vulnerability. Be open about making mistakes sometimes. They all make them. Very often, leaders are supposed to never make mistakes, and I think that could be really dangerous. So that's one thing she says. Do that as a leader, and make sure you can acknowledge that. Be the last to speak. Make sure that you don't talk all the time. Let's not make this about you. Make sure you ask more questions and understand what your people think, so you can go deeper and listen better. And then, of course, create a safe environment. It is our job as leaders to create an environment where you can fail and succeed. Create an environment where that is possible. Because at the end of the day, you could be the greatest person on earth, but if you are in an environment where that's not safe, that's not possible. That's your job as a leader. And ultimately then develop an open mindset. Be open that there might be some difficult conversations here, but listen, analyze it, and then respond to it, and be open to this idea that you might not have it all right at once. So that's that part. That's a simple, so very sort of cliff notes version of psych safety. So in a nutshell, what we need here is meaningful data and individuals and interactions. It's not about the data itself. It's about those conversations. But if you don't have psych safety, it's not going to work. If you do that, though, you can actually create that culture of data-driven continuous improvement. It is, though, something that takes intention. So this isn't something that just happens. You need intention and support from leadership. The action part here is more important than anything else. You need to make sure you invest in it and take action. Otherwise, you will lose that. You will lose credibility, and people is not going to take your feedback anymore. Create that environment where it's safe, where you can actually speak up. Don't ridicule people if they say something that might be unpopular. Make sure that that's possible. If you don't do that, this is not going to last. I can just guarantee it. And then embrace that culture by not making sure that you're not looking for answers here. That's part of the goal here. We're not just looking for answers. We're looking for a way to ask better questions. As coaches and as change leaders, that's really what matters. Understand what's going on so we can learn, because ultimately that's what this is about. It's not about the data. It's about using it as an invitation to our conversation. Use that data as a way to direct our conversation so that we're all about individuals and interactions over processes and tools. And there's a couple of people who have said that before me, about 20 years ago, as it happens. And that's why we have this Agile Reflect Festival. So that's all I had. Really passionate about this topic, so I'll be happy to take some questions. I know we're running out of time as well, but thank you for listening. I know this you have so many different options, and that you took this hour to spend with me is an honor. So thank you for doing that.